The minutes and hours immediately following an accident are usually tense times. Drivers' nerves are shaken and their adrenaline is running high. But that is also the time when the investigation into what happened begins and police officers start asking questions. While it may be human nature to respond, providing answers at a crash scene is not in the driver's best interest. In fact, Jodi Burness of Burness Paralegal says drivers should remain silent.
The number one thing a driver needs to do is to protect themselves. It's not about, quite frankly, at that moment, protecting anybody else. And the number one thing that a driver should do is refrain from making a statement. As compelling as that thought is, innocent people want to tell you how innocent they are. But at the end of the day, you don't realize what's important, what's not important. And so at that moment, when you're making that statement to the police officer during the course of the investigation, what can happen is you've got that driver wanting to prove to the officer how innocent he or she is, and they're making inculpatory statements that lead toward guilt. And so because it's an emotional time, it's energy charged, the driver, again, doesn't know what is important, and so ultimately, at that moment, just stay quiet. You have that right is entrenched in the Charter of Rights. Use it. It's there for a reason, so that the driver can protect herself. And so the right to remain silent is something that is, in my view, a powerful right and should be invoked at all costs.
Burness delivered that advice in Niagara Falls at the Fleet Safety Council's 43rd Annual Educational Conference, where she also ran a mock trial. The purpose of the trial was to give attendees a glimpse of what can go on in a courtroom. She based the trial on the case of a trucker who was charged in a fatal accident after a motorist ran into his rig, which was parked on the side of a highway. The issue of what to say and what not to say to an investigating officer was a key aspect of the trial, and Burness says drivers need to understand what information is required of them.
The legal obligation is more or less to identify yourself. Once that obligation has taken place, so that means the driver hands over his or her driver's license to the investigating officer. The officer in turn will use words like, "Tell me what happened. Hey, what happened here?" Whenever the question is posed, that will invoke the driver starting to begin to tell the story, to lay down a narrative of what happened. That's the moment that the bell should go off and say, I want to exercise my right to silence. They have an obligation to assist the officer when the officer is doing two things at once, essentially. The officer is collecting evidence by way of an investigation, but they're also doing an administrative function, which is to complete the accident report, and that's pursuant, obviously, to the insurance obligations. The Insurance Act prescribes that. And so that's where that's what muddies the waters. But once the investigation has crystallized, meaning there's now he or she, that officer, is collecting evidence, that's when and of course it's such a difficult time because the driver doesn't know what function is the officer doing right now. Is the officer collecting evidence to use against me, or is he or she collecting evidence in order to satisfy the insurance requirements? And so that's why the driver should simply just say, I'm exercising my right to silence. If the officer was to preface the exchange by saying, it's okay, at this point, I don't find you at fault. I only want you to tell me what happened because I have no other witnesses here. This is strictly for insurance purposes. And I've had that happen. The driver should require that passage in writing, because unless and until, it's dangerous. And it's dangerous because what happens in a trial several months, a year, 2 years after the fact, people forget what they said. And that's why a driver needs to, the easiest thing to do is simply just to refrain from making a statement. But again, the words need to be said. I want to exercise my right to silence. And that pretty much gets them out of trouble later on.
According to Burness, there was a limit on what information a driver is compelled by law to provide.
The obligation on a driver at the scene of an accident is to identify him or herself and to identify the vehicle, which means that they have to be able to show the permit for both the tractor and if a trailer is being hauled, obviously the trailer, the CVOR, that's the certificate of CVOR, that is a requirement as well. And obviously if the officer knows well enough, he or she may ask for a logbook, which is also an additional document that has to be surrendered. Beyond that, there is no further obligation for any documentation to be surrendered.